thank you very much for that warm introduction. I know that for many people, you'll be joining where English is your second language. So sometimes it helps to have the slides in advance. So I'm just going to put a link into the chat so you can see all of the slides there if you need them. In this session, we're going to be talking for about 50 minutes probably, and then there'll be a chance at the end for questions and answers. But I've also built in some interactivity throughout as well. So what I would say is if you've got any questions as we go through, please just put them in the chat and I will try to pick them up as we go through as well. So just very briefly to speak about myself and why I'm probably qualified to speak to you all today. I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University. My background is actually in atmospheric physics and also science communication. And probably to date, I would have said that I've given close to 1,000 professional presentations, both at conferences, seminars, workshops, etc. I've published several books on the topic, including one of the world's leading textbooks. And I've left all of my information there, my email address, my website, and my Twitter handle, because I really invite all of you to be in contact with me. So if you have any questions at all that you would like to ask me, I've just realized I need to share another presentation with you, sorry. If you've got any questions at all that you would like to ask me, then I'm really happy to answer them. And I'm really happy to work through them with you. And I know that sometimes it can be a lot of pressure asking questions in this environment. So please just feel free to reach out to me afterwards or at the end of this session, or to use chat as well. But like I said, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. So I really want to start off by saying that there are two faces to science communication. So there's the inward facing and there's the outward facing. So inward facing is when we think about communicating to other scientists. So this would be at a conference, this would be a poster presentation, this might be a workshop, a seminar, or even a meeting with our supervisor or a small group meeting. And then we also have outward facing communication. And outward facing communication is where we would engage with non-scientists. So thinking about journalists, policymakers, school children, other publics, and things like that as well. And everything that I'm going to be talking to you about today can be used for these two different styles of science communication. So the inward facing and the outward facing. But I think what we probably need to focus on the most today is really thinking about that inward facing sometimes, because as part of our scientific careers, we will always have to give presentations to other scientists. We will always have to give poster presentations to other scientists, and we will always probably have to give digital presentations to other scientists as well. So what I'm going to do is going to talk through each of those in turn, and there'll be some opportunity for interactions. And then, as I've said at the end, there'll be lots of opportunities for questions. So just feel free to put them in the chat or just think about them at the end as well. So going to start off with presenting and just really thinking about oral presentations, because as scientists, we have to give a lot of oral presentations, be it a short presentation in a group seminar, a long presentation or longer presentation at a conference, or a webinar like I'm giving with you today. And the thing with presenting, especially for those people who are presenting in a language other than their own, is that it can be quite daunting. And sometimes people think, oh, well, I'm just not very good at presenting and you're good at presenting. But that's not true. You're not naturally good at presenting, just like you're not naturally good at science. It's something that you have to practice, and it's something that takes time. And the purpose of this webinar today is really to explore some tips and techniques to help you on the way as well. And just to reiterate, I know how difficult it is to present in your second or third language. I lived in Japan for several years, and my Japanese is not what it used to be. But even when it was quite good, having to present in Japanese rather than English, I found very difficult. But what I tried to do was to follow the techniques that I'm going to be dealing with you today, and then it will help you to do the most effective and the most captivating presentation for your audience. The most important thing to remember is this triangle. And so really, this is the one thing that I would like you to take away, to definitely remember about today's session. And there's lots of different strategies for effective communication, but this is probably the most effective one that I've worked with and that I've developed. And this is grounded in a piece of research from business scholars called Peck and Dickinson. And I've adapted it myself. And what this basically says is that in order to have effective communication, there's three things that we need to consider. We need to consider the narrative. So that's what we're saying. We need to consider the audience. So that's who we're saying it to. And we need to consider the self. So that's how we're saying it. And as with any triangle, if you don't have all of these elements, then the whole thing collapses. So we need to always think about narrative. We need to always think about audience. And we need to always think about self. And when we have these three things together, we have effective communication. And we can see that these are true whether we're giving a presentation to several thousand people or we're in a one-on-one conversation with a supervisor or a line manager. We need to always think about these three things. So let's go through these in turn. Now, the first thing I want to introduce you to is rhetoric. So rhetoric, I guess, it's grounded in ancient Western philosophy, thinking, and Roman philosophy, thinking about people like Aristotle and Cicero. And Aristotle defined this as being the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that you're using all of the tools at your disposal to make sure that people listen to what you have to say. And so we can use these to help to construct our narrative and also to give captivating and effective presentations. So there's three things to consider, each of which I'll go over in turn. One of which is ethos, one of which is logos, and one of which is pathos. So ethos is an appeal to ethics, and it's a means of convincing someone of the character or credibility of the persuader. So to give you an example, as I've written there in the quote, imagine that you were a mayoral candidate. You might say, my 3 decades of experience in public service, my tireless commitment to the people of this community, and my willingness to reach across the aisle and cooperate with the opposition make me the ideal candidate for your mayor. So this is about establishing your credibility as a speaker. To give you an example of this, at the start of this webinar, Anna very kindly introduced myself, and I also talked a little bit about my expertise and my experience of presentations. And the reason that I did that was not to brag, but it was so that you would feel confident that I know what I'm talking about. Now, the good thing is that as scientists, we have this credibility. So it's really important when we give our presentations, when we're talking to people, to remind them who we are. You know, for example, my name is Dr. Sam Illingworth. I am an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University, and I am a world-leading expert in science communication, public engagement, interdisciplinary studies, and higher education. So just reminding people of our credibility is really important, because otherwise people might think to themselves, who is this? And why should I listen to them? And again, I know that there's cultural sensitivities here and that people don't always feel comfortable saying that they're brilliant. That's not what this is about. This is just about reminding the audience that you are an expert and that they should have confidence in what you have to say. So ethos, it's about establishing the credibility of the speaker. And the good thing is that as scientists, we tend to have this. We just need to remind people that we are an expert. And if you have a PhD, you are in the top 0.01% of the world's leading intellect in your field. So it's not And bragging, it's not lying to say that. It's just necessary to establish your credentials. The second thing is logos. So this is an appeal to logic, and it's a way of persuading an audience by reason. So again, to give you an example, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have not only the fingerprints, the lack of an alibi, a clear motive, an expressed desire to commit the robbery. We also have video of the suspect breaking in. The case could not be more open and shut. So again, this would be someone in a court case making a logical argument for why they were prosecuting somebody. And again, the really good thing is that with science, we follow that logical argument. We have a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, we revisit that hypothesis, and we continue in that cycle. That's the scientific process. So when we're presenting our work, reminding people of the logic of that argument is really important. Now, as scientists, we also have a responsibility to point out when there's a lack of logic. And oftentimes we might see politicians or journalists occasionally presenting work or science that doesn't have this logical argument. So it's really important for us to identify where there isn't the logic, and for ourselves to be ethical scientists and to always make sure that we present our findings in an ethical and logical manner. So to recap, there's ethos, the credibility of the speaker, which we do quite well as scientists. There's logos, the logic of the argument, which again, we do very well as scientists. The third element we're not so good at, and this is pathos. So this is an appeal to the passion, and it's a way of convincing an audience of an argument by creating an emotional response. In other words, it's appealing to the emotions of the audience. So for example, if you don't move soon, we're all going to die. Can't you see how dangerous it would be to stay? Is something we might say if there was an imminent volcanic eruption. Now, pathos is probably the strongest of the three, of ethos, logos, and pathos. And we see a lot of the times journalists might make use of this, and politicians might make use of this, but scientists don't always do this. Now, it's important that whenever we're using pathos, we don't misuse it, and that we always have a logic to our argument, but it's okay to appeal to people's emotions. So it's okay, for example, if I'm talking about the climate crisis, then it's okay for me to get angry about it, or it's okay for me to highlight why people need to be worried and sometimes scared about it as well. Because if I present it as a robot with just cold, hard facts, people are less likely to want to engage with it. Now, it's very important to say that when we're doing science, I think we need to be as objective as possible. But when we're presenting science, I think it's okay to display an element of emotion, not just appealing to the emotions of our audience, but also, we might be excited, or we might be happy, or we might be fearful about a scientific discovery that we've got. We don't need to be hyperbolic, but we need to display an element of emotions. And again, I know that sometimes this might be culturally quite difficult, but if we think about our audience, if we think about how they might respond to something, and if we target, as we're going to talk about in a second, our message to appeal to their emotions, it can be very, very effective. So using rhetoric in our science story, again, remembering rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So ethos is an appeal to ethics, and it's a means of convincing someone of the character or credibility of the persuader. So it's about convincing the audience that you as a speaker are worth listening to. Logos is an appeal to logic, and it's a way of persuading an audience by reason. And pathos is an appeal to passion. So it's an appeal to the emotions of the audience as well. And if we have all three of these things, ethos, logos, and pathos, then we can use them to construct a narrative that connects with our audience. So the second element of the triangle of effective communication I want to talk about is audience. And in particular, I want to talk about framing and framing theory. So it's really important to remember that there are no such thing as a general audience. There are multiple audiences. there are multiple publics. And if I think about all of the people that I'm talking to today, for example, you all have different scientific backgrounds, you all have different cultural heritages, you all speak a variety of different languages, but you have some commonalities. You are all active scientific researchers, and you all have an interest in science communication. Most likely, most of you also have a master's or PhD qualification as well. So that means that when I frame my discussion to you, I'm able to talk in a way that thinks about your background and your sense of an audience. So when you're thinking about your audience, it's important to try and find out as much as possible as you can about them, and then to try and frame your message accordingly. So what are frames? Well, this is a really good quote from a quite well-known paper about framing science. And it says that frames organize central ideas, defining a controversy to resonate with core values and assumptions. Frames pare down complex issues by giving some aspects greater emphasis. They allow citizens to rapidly identify why an issue matters, who might be responsible, and what should be done. In other words, framing theory suggests that how something is presented to the audience, i.e. the frame, influences how it is processed. So the way that you present your science, the way that you frame your science, as I'm going to give you some examples of in a second, to your audience, affects how likely or unlikely it is to be accepted by them, for them to engage with it, for them to be interested by it. So to give you an example of this in practice, there was a really well-known study in 2009 where basically the researchers had a conference, and they advertised this conference to a number of PhD students. And to some PhD students, they said, okay, if you register before this date, let's say the 1st of May, if you register before the 1st of May, you will get a discount, an early bird discount for registering early. And they found that about 67% of the students who got that message decided to register early because they were being rewarded with a discount. To another group of PhD students, they gave a different message. They said that if you fail to register by the 1st of May, you will be penalized and you will have the conference fees increased. So that was presented as a penalty fee. And what they found was that those students where they gave the message that if you register after the 1st of May, there will be a penalty, 93% did so. So you can see that this was in some ways appealing to their emotions, that they were worried, and it framed it in a way that made the PhD students think about, okay, this is a positive thing versus this is something I'm going to be penalized for. And we can think about that in practice. You know, if I thought, oh, there was a discount, I might want to do it. If I was worried I was going to be penalized for it, I'd probably be more likely to do so. So this is a really good example of how framing works in practice. So when we think about framing in science, many of us work on topics that are not necessarily controversial, but which need to be framed in a certain way depending on the audience that we're talking to. So people that work with the climate crisis, people that work with evolution, people that work with vaccinations, to name the three. For example, if we were working on vaccinations and we knew that we had come up with a new vaccine, but we knew that we wanted to try to communicate the effects of this vaccine to a group that were vaccine hesitant, then we wouldn't go in there and telling them, you need to do this because I tell you. Instead, we try to listen to their needs, to reassure them that this was a good idea. So in order to frame our message, we need to understand our audience, first of all. And the best way to do that is to ask. Now, it's not possible always, if you're speaking to 1,000 people, 200 people, 100 people, to be able to find out everything about all of the audience, but generally you can find out. So I knew that before this presentation to you today, a lot of you would be coming from a Chinese or European background, that you would have PhDs, that you would be interested in science communication, and that you want to find out more about how to develop captivating presentations. So that enables me to frame my message effectively to you as an audience. So there's the narrative, that's what we're saying. There's the audience, that's who we're saying it to. And then there's the self, which we're going to come on to now, and that's how we're saying it. And the biggest thing about the self is probably nerves. And all of us get nervous before a presentation, be it to 1,000 people, be it to one person. It's normal. It means normally we care about it or we're worried about it. But there's different things that we can do to prepare for a presentation before, during, and after. I always recommend to drink lots of water beforehand, just because it helps us to keep hydrated. I recommend relaxing. So it's always a good idea just 5 or 10 minutes before, just to go and find a space that you can have and occupy by yourself. It could be a quiet room somewhere. It could be the corner of an office, but just having 5 or 10 minutes to collect your thoughts beforehand and just relax is a really good idea. You might want to do some simple breathing exercises, but whatever you feel like. But the most important thing is to practice. So I tend to practice presentations between 5 or 10 times before I give them. And the reason for this is that practice makes perfect. Now, I tend not to learn a script, because if you learn a script, what happens is that it sounds quite rehearsed. And also, if you forget a word in your script, then you can lose your whole flow, which can be very difficult. So instead, what I do is I practice my presentation 5 to 10 times so that I know roughly what I'm going to say on each slide or at each point, but I don't know exactly. So what that means is it sounds natural, but I know what's coming on the next slide. I know what I'm going to say. And so it sounds as though I know what's coming. And if you practice, then what it means is that you reduce a lot of the nerves, because you're not worried about what you're going to say next, because you know. I also tend to practice without slides sometimes and just imagine what the transitions are. And it just really helps to put you back in control. And again, thinking about rhetoric, it helps to give you a command as a speaker that you have credibility and that you know what you're speaking about. If you sound flustered, that's less so, and everything just becomes a little bit difficult to process. So before a presentation, drink some water, find some time to relax, and practice, practice, practice. What about during a presentation? Well, one of the things you can do if you get a little bit flustered is to stop, gather your thoughts. Having a pause can actually just lend emphasis. And even if you stop for 2 or 3 seconds, it's okay. And it sounds as though you might be gathering your thoughts and then moving on. The second thing is to slow down. Now, if you listen to really excellent orators, they speak actually quite quietly and quite slowly. And the reason for this is, again, it gives the impression that you're not in a rush, you're in control, people want to listen to you. So just slow down, and it will make you feel much less nervous and much more in control of the situation. Again, I know if English, or if you're presenting in a language that's not your first language, there's a temptation to speak quickly because you might think as though you're sounding better. That is not the case. Just slow down and speak with emphasis. And also, it will help people to better understand what you're saying as well. So pause, slow down, and then finally, eye contact. So this is really the most true if you're in a physical presentation. If you're giving a presentation to several hundred people and you feel nervous, what I recommend doing is making eye contact with one person in the front row, hopefully somebody that you know, and just delivering the presentation to them. And then when you feel more comfortable, you can open it up and present to a few more people. If you feel nervous, go back to that one person. And it can help to reinforce that it's okay and just to deal with your nerves. So pause, slow down, and use eye contact to help you engage with different people and also be in command of the situation as well. And then finally, what about afterwards? So I always think that the best thing about all presentations, reflect. So just make a few notes, what went really well, what didn't go well, what would you improve for next time? What would you keep the same? You might be giving the same presentation to different audiences. So were there some slides that you could remove? Was there a line that worked particularly well? Was there a really difficult question that you could actually build into your presentation to stop the question coming at the end as well? So always reflect. Secondly, treat yourself. So if you've given a good presentation, you might want to treat yourself to a piece of cake. Normally, if I've gone to a conference, for example, I'll go for a run after a presentation as I've got a lot of adrenaline and I just want to go away and relax. And then finally, just be kind. Everybody gives bad presentations sometimes. Everybody gives excellent presentations sometimes. If I think back to, for example, when I was a PhD student, I gave some really bad presentations. I remember once giving a presentation at Oxford University, and I told a lot of jokes. They weren't funny. Nobody laughed. It was horrible. It was very, very awkward. But I reflected on it. I learned from it. And I tried to think more about my audience and maybe when it's appropriate to use humor or not. So just be kind to yourself. Things will go well, things won't go well. Move on from it, learn from it, reflect, treat yourself, be kind. And if you think about all of these things, the nerves before, nerves during, nerves after, it will really help you and yourself with that triangle of effective communication. But the most important thing of all of this, I know it sounds so obvious, but it's so true, is to practice. I practice giving this webinar before I gave it to you. I practice before I speak to my students. I practice before I give seminars. I practice before I have one-to-one meetings with my supervisor, because I know that I then know what's going to come next and I can anticipate it and remove my nerves and be in command of the situation. So I just wondered if anybody has any tips themselves for how they deal with nervousness. Please feel free to share them in the chat as we continue through. Something someone told me that they used to do is, just basic breathing exercises. See what some people have put in the chat already. Okay, great question from Zikwan. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. The thing that stresses you is how to respond in a question and answer session. I can give you some tips now on how to deal with question and answers, because I agree that is a very stressful situation. Okay, so if somebody gives you a question that you don't know the answer to, it's okay to say that you don't know. Because really, when you're presenting in a conference, for example, somebody might come up with a really, really clever idea that will help your research, but you'd never thought of it before. But you don't want to necessarily become flustered. So this happens to me. What I tend to say is, for example, that is an excellent question. Thank you so much. I'd not considered that before. Maybe we could explore that offline and think about how we can collaborate together. So offline just means not in this question and answer session that's high pressure. It means over coffee or over dinner or via email. And then you're acknowledging the difficult question, you're thinking about how to move on from it, and you're working on it together. So first of all, you can just say, I don't know, let's talk about this offline. The second thing you can do is that if you really don't want to say you don't know, and I think it's fine to say that, by the way, if you really don't want to say that, you can answer the question by answering another question. So For example, if somebody said to me, Sam, I find question and answers really difficult. How do I deal with that stress of a presentation? And I don't know how to answer it. I could say, that's an excellent question. Dealing with stress in presentations is really hard. One of the ways that we can deal with stress in presentations is to breathe and relax and be kind to ourselves. So you can see I didn't answer the question about question and answers. I answered the question about stress instead. That's a technique that a lot of politicians use, and it just enables you to move on. But I honestly think the best thing to do is just to say, if you don't know, I'm not sure, please can we talk about this offline? The other way to prepare for question and answers is to give your presentation to some colleagues prior to the presentation itself, and they will come up with questions that will probably be the same questions that you get in a conference or a seminar, and then you can practice giving them as well. Again, if you don't understand the question, it's okay to ask, please can you reword that? And if somebody gives a question that's, you know, more of a comment, you can say, thank you very much for that. We don't quite have time to get into that now. Let's talk about that offline. So I hope that helps for advice on answering questions and answers. Yunala said, I've read something about chewing gum. Chewing gum before a presentation might help you to feel more relaxed. I think whatever works for you. Again, I wouldn't chew gum during the presentation because it just can become a distraction. Similarly, I know this is really awkward, but if you're giving a physical presentation, I would really recommend filming yourself give the presentation, because what you will notice is that sometimes you have physical tics or gestures that you do that can become distracting. So for example, I know when I did this, I used to always lift one of my legs, which is quite strange. And then as a result, I stopped doing that. Other people like tap their pockets. And if you've got keys in your pockets or something like that, it can be very distracting. So I would really recommend filming yourself, seeing how you start, seeing how you appear, and then critiquing yourself, but again, being kind. And yeah, if you want to chew gum before a presentation, then that's a really good idea. But I would recommend, again, making sure that you've got time to dispose of the gum before the presentation as well. Great. Thanks very much for those questions. Please keep them coming, and I will happily answer them throughout. So we've kind of dealt with presentations there, oral presentations. I just want to think about the key messages there. Remember the triangle of effective communication: narrative, what you're saying; audience, who you're saying it to; self, how you're saying it. Use rhetoric to construct your narrative. So think about ethos, the credibility of you, the speaker; logos, the logic of the argument; and pathos, the appeal to the emotions of the audience. Use framing to consider your audience. What do you know about the audience? What's their background? What's their experience? And how can you frame your narrative to most likely connect with them as a result? And then finally, just be kind to yourself. You know, giving presentations is stressful, it's difficult. But after everyone, reflect, think about what you did well, think about what could have done better, but always just be kind to yourself. If it goes very badly, learn from it, draw a line, and move on. Okay, so I want to think about poster design now, because for lots of us, you know, designing posters for physical or digital conferences is very important. You know, if we think about a traditional scientific conference where there might be several thousand people there, not everybody can possibly present orally, so there'll be lots of poster presentations as well. And I actually find poster presentations myself as a researcher to be much more useful, especially for ongoing work. What tends to happen at conferences is with oral presentations, you speak, you get 2 or 3 minutes of questions, and it's a good way of maybe presenting finished work. There's not really an opportunity to interact. With poster presentations, what tends to happen is that you're stood by the poster for 2 or 3 hours. So people can come and talk to you, they can engage with you, you can talk about your research. And from my own experience, giving poster presentations has led to many, many collaborations, future research grants, future research publications as well. So Posters sometimes get a bad reputation as being secondary to an oral presentation, but actually I disagree. And I think that posters are a great way of communicating our science and of having the time and the space to engage with other researchers. But how can we design our posters so that they are captivating and so that they are effective at communicating our message? Well, a few things. First of all, use structure to tell your story. So again, thinking about your science story, thinking about a traditional story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, the beginning of your story would be the context, the rationale, the hypothesis. What did you set out to do? Why did you set out to do it? The middle bit of the story, the methods, the results, the analysis. What did you find? And what does this mean? And then the final part of the story, conclusions and future plans. So did you answer your hypothesis? And if so, what does that mean? And if not, what are you going to do next? So thinking about using structure to tell your story, and again, thinking about your audience. So if you're presenting to a Western audience in English, then you would always read from left to right and top to bottom. So think about the structure of your actual poster telling that story so that people move across the poster and move down the poster to hear that story. Just going to pull my blind down. But if you're in a different cultural context, then you would use a different structure. So think about your audience, think about how they engage with it, and use the structure to tell that story, moving from your hypothesis all the way through to the conclusions and the implications for future study. Second piece of advice is use text sparingly. So most posters tend to be A1 or A0. I would recommend 300 words maximum because people won't read more than that. Instead, can you use visuals? So this is an example myself. On the right, this is the abstract from a research publication that looked at the ways in which volcanoes have been perceived by poets over the past 200 years and what that tells us about the relationship between humans and volcanoes. As a side note, this research came about from a poster presentation that I gave, and someone came to speak to me about it. Ariana and me and her collaborated and ended up with this publication. So on the right, you can see the abstract. It's on a poster that's too many words. It's not very interesting. On the left, this is a visual abstract. So I wrote a poem about the abstract and Ariana painted a picture and we combined the two together. Now, I'm not saying you have to use poetry or art, but the visual, if I was in a crowded poster hall, I'm much more likely to go over to the picture of a volcano than I am to a large ream of text. So use text sparingly. And I would say at most 300 words on an A1 or A0 poster. The other thing to remember is with a poster, the purpose of the poster is that people can read it to understand what's going on, but that you can provide additional context as the presenter. So you don't have to have everything on there. You just need to be able to give people a flavor, and you want them to be able to ask you more to find out more about the study as well. Always check your spelling and grammar. So when you do use text, make sure there are no typographical errors, as otherwise your poster can look really unprofessional. Again, if you're creating a poster in a language other than your first language, ask a colleague or a native speaker to check it through to make sure that there are no grammatical or spelling errors, because it just looks unprofessional and people are less likely to want to engage with it. And again, it affects the credibility of you as a speaker and reduces your ethos and hence the capacity for people to engage. Use a color wheel. So you can just Google image search this or Bing search this, and this is what a color wheel is. Now, a color wheel basically shows you what complementary colors are. So that is Colours opposite each other on the colour wheel are complementary, which means they have the greatest contrast, which means that the text shows up the clearest. So, for example, if you have a yellow background, use purple text. Yellow and purple are opposite each other on the colour wheel. They're the most complementary and they're the most easy to read. But having said that, I always think less is more. So I always use this image because I think it's a really nice demonstration of how the McDonald's logo has evolved over time to be something very busy, to be something very simple and clean. And those posters that have a lot going on with lots of different colors and lots of text and lots of images, they're very difficult to understand and to read. So instead, think about stripping everything back and making it as accessible as possible. So I think white posters with plain black text in quite big font with some effective images are a really great way of communicating your poster effectively. And then finally, provide further information. So you're not always going to be stood next to your poster, and it might be that somebody's looking at your poster whilst you're talking to somebody else. So I always have information about yourself, about the study, and try to include a QR code. People can just take a photo of your poster, but I tend to make a QR code, which you can just do online. And the QR code tends to either link to my personal website, samillingworth.com, or to the research paper that I'm presenting, so that people can find out more information and they can get in contact with me if they need to as well. So again, I think it just looks professional to include this information. I tend to include my email, my LinkedIn profile, my OrcID, and my website, or just your website or just your email is fine as well. And again, making a QR code doesn't take very long, but it just looks professional and helps to establish your credibility as a speaker. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of posters, and I'd like you to give me some feedback as to whether or not you think they're good posters or not, and we can have a discussion about that in the chat. But before I do so, just again, thinking about questions and answers. When you're stood next to your poster, you don't need to immediately jump on everybody that comes to your poster. You can just give them time. So if I'm presenting with a poster, I'll stand next to my poster. I'll allow people to just have a few minutes to read it. And then I'll say to them, have you got any questions about the poster, or can I help? It's also a good idea to have maybe prepared a 1 or 2 minute brief overview, so that if somebody comes up to you and says, can you tell me about your work? You can tell them in 1 or 2 minutes what the overview is. Again, don't learn a script, just roughly know what you're going to say. And having that can help to prepare you as well. And I really must reiterate that posters are a fantastic way of communicating and developing collaboration with other scientists as well. So I'm just going to show you 2 posters. Now, I know the image on the screen might be quite small, but I just want you in the chat, if you can, to tell me if you think this is a good or bad poster and why. What is it about this poster that's good? Or what is it about this poster that's bad? And why might that be the case? Let's give you a few seconds to write that in the chat. And then I can give some commentary as well. But there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just thinking about all the things we talked about, so using text sparingly, making it uncluttered, having some visuals, making it clear to read, and using structure to tell a story. Does this poster do a good job of that or not? Okay, so Yang says the color is complementary. Yeah, I think that is true. So this was when I was a postdoc at the University of Manchester doing research on that aircraft with remote sensing. And the University of Manchester had a color scheme of purple and gold, which is complementary. And so I tried to make the poster have that to be complementary. But that being said, as Kalani said, there's a lot of empty space. So maybe the images can be enlarged. I think that's a really good comment. And as Angela says, it's so crowded. I totally agree. I don't know why I thought this would look cool to have a picture of the research aircraft behind it, but it just looks really cluttered. I think it would have been much better to have a white background, to have less images. And actually, despite me saying don't use too much text, there's hardly any text here. I've got some arrows showing where to follow, but it's very difficult to understand what on earth's going on. So I think I tried to be a little too clever here. And you're right, Unal, some text on the poster is probably not readable. So there's some good things there, but also some less good things. Yang, exactly, Yang. It's very hard to navigate. I totally agree. So what about this poster? What do you think? Is this a good or a bad poster? Just leave some comments in the chat. So this is a poster about some work when I was a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. And this was looking at a series of science and art interventions and teaching that I'd done. And presenting them. So Kalani says it's too wordy, and Shaoshan says too many words as well. I would agree. I think it is too wordy. I think that what I've tried to do there is try to present too much information in the space provided. There's probably about 400 or 500 words there. I would say that there's actually considerably less text than there are on many scientific posters I see, but I think you're all right. There's too much text there. I think what's good about it is I think it's quite clear. It's quite a clean design. Yes, it is. I agree. Thank you, Angela. I agree. It is attractive. And I think that the pictures are quite nice and you're drawn to them. It's got a good title. It's clear something else that I don't like about this is that I put our Twitter handles rather than our email addresses. And I think I don't know what I was trying to do. I was trying to be innovative, but Twitter's not always the best medium. I think people would have liked email addresses as well as a Twitter handle. So less words, but maybe it's quite a clean design, which is good. And I think it would be good next time to have an email address instead. But I think in my head at least, I think that this poster is by far worse than this poster. But both of them have things that could be improved. Okay, great. So we've talked about oral presentations in person. We've talked about posters. What are the key findings to this? Well, the key message is have a clear narrative. What is it that you want to say exactly? I mean, good practice for any presentation, again, is before you start doing the PowerPoint presentation or the poster, just write down what is the key message. Because oftentimes we just start designing our presentations, oral or poster, without thinking about what those key messages are. So what are the key messages? When you know what they are as well in your oral presentation, that can be your last slide. But always think about what your key messages are first and then design your poster or your oral presentation around it. And with a poster, use the structure to tell the narrative. Use less text, 200 or 300 words. Check the formatting. Again, get a native speaker to look at it. That can really help. And always provide further info. How can people get in contact with you? How can people find out more information about yourself? So we talked about oral presentations. We talked about poster presentations. One final section now, and then we're going to go into the Q&A. And that's presenting digitally. So obviously with the COVID pandemic, a lot of us were moved to more remote working practices, and webinars such as this one are far more common, and all of us will have to present digitally at some time. So I just wanted to talk about how to give effective digital presentations, how to give effective remote presentations. Now, I love speaking in person and meeting people in person, but I also like presenting remotely. And I think to be an effective scientist, an effective science communicator in the 21st century, you need to be good at giving in-person presentations, and you need to be good at giving digital presentations as well. So first thing to think about is don't forget the analog. So all of the things that I've talked about already are still valid. Don't forget them. You know, think about the rhetoric, think about the triangle of effective communication, think about your narrative. And also remember these things. There are many publics. So there is no such thing as a general public. There is no such thing as a scientific public. Like all of us on this webinar today have commonalities, but we're also very different. So try to think and remember that there are many publics, and to find out the most about the audience that you're engaging with, and to tailor your message accordingly. Number two, all voices should be heard. So what do I mean by that? Well, you want to create a platform and create opportunities where everybody can input. And actually, I think the digital environment is very good for this, because for many people, especially people that are maybe early career researchers, it can be quite daunting to ask a question or to engage in face-to-face interactions. But with the digital, especially with the chat function and instant messenger, it can be much more inclusive, and people can leave comments and people can feel happier to do so as well. Again, especially when we're speaking in maybe a second or third language. So think about how we can use the platform to help all voices to be heard, and chat's a really good way of doing that. And remember that attendance does not equal engagement. So even though you might have 400 people on your webinar call, if you're just speaking at them and not really engaging with them, then you just need to remember that. I think a good way to develop engagement is to be interactive. So use the medium. Remember that we're in a digital medium, right? So you don't need to just give a presentation like you're in a physical room. Think more about the medium. Use polls, use chat, use questions and answers function, use some activities, and be creative. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a second. The other thing to say is just to make sure you understand the format that you're in. So we're using Zoom, which functions slightly differently to WebEx, which functions slightly differently to MS Teams. So just make sure you understand all of the format of the medium that you're using, again, because if you don't, it can affect your credibility as a speaker and reduce your ethos and reduce people's willingness to trust that you are an expert on this field. So just do a little bit of homework, practice. Always if somebody gives you the invitation to come onto the call early to test that your slides are working, etc., always do that. So I want to give you an interactive example. You won't know this, but a lot of my research actually involves poetry and involves developing conversations between different audiences, especially marginalized or underserved populations, and using poetry as a way to help communicate science to non-scientific audiences. So I use poetry a lot in my work. So we're going to write a poem. It's going to be a very easy poem. It's going to be a list poem. So I want you to get all so it can be a pen and paper, it can be your keyboard, it can be anything you want. And we're going to write a list poem. So with a list poem, what you do is you write everything that comes into your head when I say a word. So don't overthink it. You can write in any language. It doesn't have to be English. Just write everything that comes into your head. It can be people, it can be ideas, it can be positives, it can be negatives. I'm just going to give you a prompt, and then you're going to write for 1 minute when I say go. So the prompt is science, go. So just start writing down everything that you can about the word science. So things, people, ideas, memories, good things, bad things. It can be very literal. It can be very, very metaphorical. It can be memories of your PhD studies. It can be memories of a field trip. It could be research that you're currently engaged with. It could be stuff that you've done with your axes before. Just anything that comes to mind when you hear the word science. You've got about 20 seconds left. And just the important thing is just to keep writing. It can be sentences. It can be single words. It can be whatever you want. And again, it doesn't have to be in English. It can be multiple languages if you want. About 10 seconds left. Just keep writing. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, there. So if you want to, feel free to put your list poem into the chat. You don't have to. It's just a bit of fun if you would like to. And we can read those through. But you can see by having like just a little activity part of the way through the presentation, it's a really good way of just helping to have audience engagement. Similarly, inviting people to have chats, inviting people to comment on your slides, etc. It's just a good way to remind the audience that you are there and that you want to engage with them as well. So the other thing, of course, is to remember all audiences. So let's have a look. So I'll read out some of these list poems that are coming in. Thank you very much, Kalani. So Kalani has catalyst, research, pollution, electrochemistry, Nobel Prize, fuel cell. It's a very nice list poem. Thank you. I always think that these are a great way as well to get an insight into how people view science and how positive people think as well. Kalani, you are much more confident when you think about science if you're saying the word Nobel Prize, especially if you're thinking about your own research, which I really hope you are, because that's amazing. I know with my research, that's probably not something I'd ever be thinking about. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. So yeah, just to remember all audiences. So remember what I said about thinking about the platform that you're on. So think about the platform that your audience is on. Do they have access to high-speed internet? Do they have access to Zoom? Do they have access to WebEx? Do they have access to WhatsApp? What do they have access to? What does your audience feel comfortable engaging with? And for example, the audience that we're with today, Zoom's a great medium for this because Euraxes are providing the account, so it can go for over 45 minutes. People in this audience are familiar with using Zoom because they will have used it with their research. It's got some great functionality like chat and sharing the slides, etc. So, and it can enable you to record as well. So it's a very, very good platform to use for this audience. So really think about your digital presentations, that you picked the right platform for your audience. So to summarize then, the key messages for digital presentations: don't forget your analog training. Think about everything we've talked about. Think about using rhetoric, think about the triangle of effective communication, think about your narrative, what you're saying, your audience, who you're saying it to, and the self, how you're saying it. Pick a platform that works for your audience. Again, ask that audience, which platform would they most like to use in this instance? Try to make the session interactive, depending on your audience again. Create an environment in which all voices can be heard, and be creative. I think that people value creativity, and again, creating a space where people can be involved if they want to, but they don't have to be involved. Just a side note on this, there's a lot of research that's been done recently about video cameras. So I know some people insist that you turn the camera on. I don't think that's a good idea. It should be absolutely up to the person who's in the webinar whether they want the video on or not as listeners, because a lot of the time participants will be in a situation where they might not be able to show their room or where they don't feel comfortable. So just leave it up to the participants. Lots of research coming out on this, that it's much more engaging to allow people to decide themselves whether or not they want to have their video on or off. So just a reminder for further reading, this is a book that I wrote for the Institute of Physics called Effective Science Communication, a practical guide to surviving as a scientist. I think this book has been downloaded over 300,000 times now. The third edition is coming out next year, but feel free to check it out. Your institute will almost certainly have an ebook account of it. If not, just get in contact and I'll see if I can help. And then, yeah, I just wanted to finish off by opening the floor for questions and answers. But just to finally remind you of, there's my name, there's my website, and there's my email address. I will now stop sharing so that I can field questions. As I'm doing so, I will just once more copy the link to the presentation so that you've got it. And I will also put my email address into the chat. And yeah, I'm really happy for the next 20 minutes or so to answer any questions that you might have. So just put all of them in the chat and I'll go through them one by one. If you want to ask a question by coming onto the microphone, please just raise your hand virtually and we can unmute you and you can do that. So just start writing your questions and I'll answer them. So Unal asks, how about communicating with clarity on complex and conceptual ideas to those with limited knowledge and understanding? This is often seen in job ads. That's a really good question, Unal. So the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to think about the audience that you're going to speak with and then find somebody, a representative from that audience, and then work with them in the first place to ensure that the message that you're developing is appropriate for them and is in a language that's useful for them. Now, again, the use of jargon is something we need to be very careful of. So jargon is a complex term that people might not have heard of before. And actually, it's okay to use jargon as long as we define it. We don't want to have too much jargon because it can become overwhelming. And secondly, it's really important to always define those words, especially words that can have multiple interpretations. So for example, long-term patterns means something very different to a meteorologist as it does to a paleontologist. So really thinking about when you're using a phrase, even if it's something that people are familiar with, define it yourselves, remove any ambiguity. Don't be afraid of introducing new phrases, but always define it yourself. And in terms of really complex and conceptual ideas to those with limited understanding, find a representative from that audience, first of all, and then try out your ideas. Ask them how to understand it. The other thing that I'd really recommend doing, and this goes back to what Anna was saying at the top, is use ChatGPT or Bard. So I am a huge advocate for ChatGPT. I actually just bought the pro license version this morning because I've been using it so much. It's really, really useful. So what I do is you say to it, ChatGPT or Bard, give them like your abstract or a body of work and say, please summarize this for a high school audience, or please summarize this for a group of 10-year-olds, or please summarize this for policymakers. And it does an amazing job of summarizing that work for that specific audience. So it does the first part, the hard part for you. You can then go out to that audience and test it with them. Or I'm sure your axes have always talked about this already, but always remembering to fact check what chatbots come back with. But as a starting point, it's really, really good. And so I'll come back to how I use ChatGPT in science communication as well, actually, because people might find that interesting. So Angela asks a recap on how to deal with nervousness. My network was not so good. Okay, Angela. So 3 things. There's the before, there's the during, and the after. So before the presentation, practice. Like practice giving your presentation. Don't learn a script, but just practice what's going to come next. Practice those slide transitions. Find some time to relax, just 5 or 10 minutes before, like find a quiet corner somewhere and drink plenty of water. During the presentation, slow down, feel free to have a pause. And if you're feeling nervous in a physical space, maintain eye contact with one person. And then when you feel more comfortable, bring it out to the wider audience. If you feel nervous again, back to one person and then out again. And then after the presentation, reflect what went well, what didn't go well, what could have gone better next time, what would you keep the same. Treat yourself, because you've done something that's quite difficult. You might have a piece of cake, you might go for a run, you might play some games, whatever you want, and then be kind. Just, presentations are difficult. You'll get things right, you'll get things wrong. So just take all of that into consideration. So that's the before, the during, and the after. But the best thing I can give for nerves is to just practice, because if you practice, you're going to know what's going to come next. So you remove an element of ambiguity, which is likely to make you feel nervous. Please feel free to keep putting the questions into the chat. Anna might have some questions as well, but I can talk to you about how I use ChatGPT for effective science communication, especially for presentations. So one of the things I do is I give a brief synopsis of what my work is going to be. and then I ask it to pull out the key findings and what are the key points. And then I can use those key points to structure it. I can then also say, hey, Bard, hey, ChatGPT, this is my audience. This is how many minutes I've got. This is the platform. And these are the key messages. Please, can you provide a sample structure for my presentation? It will then provide a sample structure for your presentation. Away from presentations, I use ChatGPT for everything. Like I use it for like planning out Twitter schedules. I use it for rewriting elements of my work that's not very good. For example, if I get some peer review back that says your conclusion could be better, I'll say to ChatGPT, could you please make my conclusion paragraph more engaging? And then I'll work with it and engage with it as well. Always being careful of what the policies of the unit of the research publications are, etc. But I think ChatGPT and Bard are really, really great tools for effective science communication, and also for just removing boring admin tasks. So for example, another thing will be, I need to write an email to somebody saying this, please draft it for me. And it will then give me half an hour of my day back to do interesting science communication activities. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate for ChatGPT in almost any situation.
Thanks a lot, Sam. I think we couldn't find a better speaker, like more aligned with the topic and like how we kicked off this communication training this year. And I think also unintentionally, you gave us a lot of homework also after this training. Because no, I liked a lot that you highlighted that you know, it doesn't end with the presentation. To get better, you really need to do what I personally really don't like doing, like looking at the recording of myself, listening to my voice, and looking at pointing at all the little negative things that I don't realize, and I need to improve. So you know, a lot of homework also after this session. And look, let me just invite everyone one more time, if they have questions and they want to take advantage of this last few minutes. I also allowed everybody to unmute themselves. If it's okay with you, Sam, since we are a small group, people could just like jump in. You're not allowed to unmute yourself. So you can show yourself if you like, or just talk directly into your microphone and ask your question in a more direct way. And before I give the floor to Halder, I'm sure he's gonna take advantage. He's a big fan of ChatGPT. I'm gonna just remind everybody, since we were talking about ChatGPT again with Sam, it is very useful, and we try to, you know, create a tool that is available to all the participants of today's session. So maybe we can drop the link again in the chat box today. We created this little tool that provides you with a 2-3 minutes script for potential, you know, pitch of your research topic, where you can input, excellent, Halder, thanks for sharing the link again. You can input your position, what's your research topic, why it is important, and also adjust how humoristic you want it to be, or how professional, or you know, how much to an expert audience you want it to be. And then you have a first draft that of course you need to go through, that you can adapt, but you know, it also like helps us you know, get rid of the blank page feeling that can be a little bit overwhelming when you start from scratches. So I think Halder wants to jump in. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Not so much to talk about ChatGPT, although I'm a big fan. I think it's a great way. We put together the tool mostly because a lot of the people here cannot access it on the mainland China. So we're using this instead, which is based on the same thing. But it is indeed an excellent way for people, especially people that might not be super good with English. You know, it's a really nice way to bridge the gap a bit, right? And get going and get over that little thing. But thank you so much, Sam, for this amazing presentation that you just came through here. like just went through here. I really thought it was excellent and really good. And what I think was very particularly different from today's presentation from some of the other trainers that we got so far is that it's very clear that you're from academia. You're obviously a communication expert, but you're also like speaking as a researcher, and you're also emphasizing things that I think a lot of researchers do think about and care about when they are trying to communicate their ideas. And you already clearly went through some of the things that are common pitfall for researchers, including like overly jargon and a lot of text on the slides and things like that. But maybe looking at it from the other side, I wonder if you could like let us know in what way you have seen researchers being really successful with communication. I think communicators always need to pick a style, right? And I have a hard time imagining a researcher going out there and being all, you know, like a preacher in a southern US church or something like that. It's probably not the style that they would go with, right? But, you know, like what is the sort of style where researchers have an easy time to get like really fluent and good at communicating their ideas? Have you noticed anything like that?
Thanks, Haldo. That's a really good question. I think for me, there's a really excellent quote by a brilliant communicator called Thomas Dalby. He's given lots of very, very good TED Talks on the matter. But he always says that you should have the confidence to stand in your own truth. And what that means is that be yourself. So, you know, I'm quite an extroverted and confident and outgoing person. So I don't mind occasionally using some humor or occasionally getting something wrong or being, you know, I'm British, so it's very normal for me to be very self-deprecating as well. That's like a cultural thing. So I'm myself and I try to be myself, and I understand that will connect with some audiences and with others it won't. And I think that everybody here, you know, and the really good presenters that I've seen, they're not, like you say, they're not people that are like, you know, Southern preachers. They're not like parodies of Barack Obama, who are all very, very good presenters. They're people who are themselves. And when you're yourself, you feel comfortable and you feel much more likely and much more engaged. And as well as that, people who are passionate about their research. And, you know, being passionate, it doesn't mean like screaming and like shouting from the rafters, but it's when it's so obvious that you're excited and that you want to share this work with other people. And I know, especially speaking to this audience, like especially speaking to people that are scientists, not everybody does tend to be extroverted. You can be a brilliant presenter and be very quiet and very introverted. That's what microphones are for. But, you know, just having that confidence to stand in your own truth, I think is a really lovely phrase. And I think they're definitely the best presenters, the people who are themselves and who feel confident and comfortable in being themselves as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a trick. I think maybe people should also think about because I think most of you that are in academia might have experienced really great teachers in the past. What makes a really good teacher a good teacher? And normally it's because, you know, like there's something there that like catches you because they're saying something that actually communicates that they care about this and they really believe in it and whatever. They might not be the best communicators, but you still listen to them. And that's just like, I think that's a really excellent advice, Sam.
Thanks a lot also for answering this question. I see one last question came in. From David Perez de Lara. Do you have any advice to make a presentation in Asian countries like Japan and Asia? Like we heard that you have lived and worked quite a few years in Japan.
Yeah, okay. So again, it's a good question. I think the most important thing is to think about the cultural differences about the location that you're presenting in. And again, understanding that not everybody in Japan is the same and not everybody in China is the same. But if I'm presenting to a broadly Chinese audience versus a broadly English audience, I would have a different tone. Like, you know, for example, when I'm speaking to a primarily English audience, I know that those people have the same cultural touchstones as me. So, for example, if I was referencing pop culture, then we could reference the same things and talk about it, and it would be on a par. Similarly, again, that use of self-deprecation is something that is inherent. Now, that's not to say that Chinese people can't also be self-deprecating, but I think it's about knowing the audience, tailoring it effectively. And for example, when I give presentations to Chinese audiences or Japanese audiences, which I still do, I'll normally run the rough sketch, the rough idea past a colleague who is Chinese or Japanese, just to say that, does this make sense? Is this offensive in any way? Like, not that I'd be deliberately offensive, or is this going to be engaging? Am I missing something? Is this the right platform? So I think always ask. Unal, that's a great question about using double language, English and Chinese slides when doing a presentation in China. The honest answer is I think it depends. So again, I've given like very high budget presentations, like for big companies where they can afford to help make a dual translation of the slides. The other thing is that as a like intermediary, the transcription that's available, the live transcription in certain web-based browsers is very good. So for example, MS Teams, I think the transcription in multiple languages is excellent, maybe a little bit better than Zoom. So I think that's about understanding those audiences and knowing them. Again, sometimes I've given presentations where I have a translator there as well. It just depends about the practicalities as well. But having one way that you might do it that's semi-cost effective is if you were presenting in English to a non-English audience, you could maybe do your slides in non-English and then speak yourself in English. And that's quite a good way of doing it. But again, just having an element of pragmatism and just always asking. I think that's the best thing we can do. As scientists, we should be naturally inquisitive anyway, but just always ask what your audience wants rather than assume what your audience needs. And I think that that's really, really important when we're giving these presentations as well.
Great. We have a question from Yang. I think it's not easy to answer. No, he's asking how to make an audience enthusiastic about what you want to share in a short presentation.
Okay, that again, it's a really good question though, Yang, and it is possible. Think about your audience. So what are they interested in? So for example, let's say that I'm talking to a group of young people in an inner city in England about the climate crisis, right? They might be interested, they might not. So what I would do first is, let's say it's a youth group. I'd go to the youth group and I'd ask the youth group leader, what are they interested in? Now, let's say that they tell me that this is broad stereotypes, but that it's a group of young men and they love cars, okay? In which case then what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame my presentation around cars and the impact of cars on the climate crisis, not just negative, also thinking about electric cars, etc. So that's a way, and you can always find an angle, always, but again, you have to ask. So find your audience, find a representative from that audience and ask them, hey, this is science that I think is really cool, or that I think is really important, or that I do, but what about this audience? Is there an aspect or an element of this that I can focus on, that I can frame to make it effective and engaging and captivating for them?
Wow, this is the very, very last shot for anyone to ask a question during the webinar. Otherwise, you are very welcome to send your questions to us or directly to Sam. And well, David is saying your talk was terrific, and I really very much agree. Thanks a lot for being with us today, Sam. It was really very interesting. I myself learned quite a bit, and I'm sure the audience appreciated a lot. And I promise we will try to make the next session as terrific as this was. I think we're gonna close it here. Thanks a lot, Sam, and thanks a lot to everyone who was with us today. Have a good evening.
Thank
Have
you,
a
Sam.
good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
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 I'm gonna close it in a few seconds.
Anna, maybe we can do a breakout room and just continue to discuss a little.
Oh, yes, we can do that.
All right. What an excellent speaker.
One minute, bathroom break. 1 minute. I'll be right back. Sorry.
Go. No worries. No hurry. All right.
Maybe I should stop.